Alexei Navalny in the past a little bit, this Russian opposition figure who's allegedly poisoned in Siberia last year. I can just briefly kind of summarize what was said to have happened to him. He got sick on a plane that was headed for Moscow. He was actually in flight, and it ended up having to make an emergency landing in another Siberian city where he ended up being hospitalized on, I think, August 20th. And pretty much immediately, Navalny's own people have been claiming that he was definitely poisoned by the Russian government. And by August 22nd, he was flown to a hospital in Germany to be treated. A few days after that, he had been there. The German government then said they had confirmed that he was poisoned with a nerve agent resembling Novichok, which people might recall played a major role in the whole Sergei Skripal case in the UK in 2018. So that's basically just like the shortest version of the story possible. Germany and a bunch of other Western countries are insisting that Navalny was poisoned by the Russians. They're demanding Putin fesses up to it. I think the U.S. and the EU and maybe even others by now have imposed sanctions over this. So it has had some like geopolitical consequences beyond just the poisoning itself or him getting sick itself. And I will say right up front, too, like, I don't claim to know what happened to this guy here. Like, I don't completely reject the possibility that maybe he was poisoned by some FSB agents or something. He is a big Putin critic, and I guess he was kind of an annoyance to the government over there. I don't think he's ever really been a serious threat to the state there or any kind of serious opposition figure with a lot of popular support. But still, governments do evil things, and the Russian government is no exception to that. However, we have just seen a lot of very weird and fishy things with this whole case, very much like we saw with the Skripal scandal, things that just kind of don't add up, and there's holes and consistencies in the story. And also when you kind of consider the incentive for NATO states like Germany and the US to accuse Russia of things like this, as we've seen in other cases in the last couple of years, I think there is some room to be skeptical about this entire story. And so with that said, yeah, let's get into the latest kind of weird anomaly in this whole story. And there are other ones I'd like to run down too, but we can start with the most recent. So earlier this month, the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, put out this report sort of summarizing some of their recent activities. And the document is actually kind of boring and mundane in most ways. Like, there's really not that much that's interesting about it. However, in the section on Navalny, it suddenly changes up the timeline for the story in a way that really raises a lot of questions. So Navalny got sick on August 20th in Russia, and he wasn't admitted to the German hospital until August 22nd, 2 days later. And the OPCW had previously said that German officials had requested help from the OPCW, like to send a technical team, on September 4th. And so that would mean the Germans contacted this the chemical watchdog, like quite a few days after he had arrived in Germany, which would kind of make sense. You know, they do some of their own tests. They look at him and go, geez, it looks like maybe this guy was poisoned with something. Let's call in the experts. However, now in this new document, and people can see it on the screen, the old and the new versions of the story from the OPCW, they say they deployed their team to Germany on August 20th, which is very strange because Navalny wasn't even in Germany at that point. German doctors had not done any test on him. There's really no strong reason to believe that a chemical weapon was used at that point. And so it's very odd that they would be calling in the chemical weapons watchdog just instantly, right away. And if this really is the correct date, if August 20th it was the date that they deployed their team, it would suggest to me that the Germans had already kind of made up their mind about what happened before they had even collected a shred of evidence. Like, they would have had to call up the OPCW immediately within minutes or hours of the reports of Navalny being sick on this airplane, at which point it wouldn't have been clear at all what had happened to him. And so the fact that go ahead.
And just for the purposes of the timeline, Will, this was before he was on the plane to Germany, right? I guess, was there any reason to suggest that he would go to Germany right away? I mean, there's several countries that would have been closer that would have been in the NATO orbit, Poland and the Baltic states. So that's I guess what's suspicious to me.
Yeah, that is also. I think there are some like sort of gaps in the story because I believe like Angela Merkel publicly offered assistance like after there had been reports that this guy was sick, that, oh, we have a hospital you can come here for. But I am kind of curious like exactly how that happened. Was that just she extended that offer publicly, or was she like sort of communicating, or her people, her staffers, communicating with Navalny's people behind the scenes somehow? And like sort of that's what led up to her public offer of help. Like, I think that stuff is still kind of not clear. But regardless, if they indeed had requested help on August 20th before Navalny was even in their country at all, that would seem very hasty to me. Like, even let's just say that they had been in touch with Navalny's people somewhat, and hey, it looks like he might have been poisoned or something. The fact that they would call in the OPCW before they even looked at him, like, again, that just seems they're a little bit too eager to have this be a chemical weapons poisoning kind of story. And in the German government's own statements on this, they do say that they ran tests on Navalny like sometime in his first few days at the hospital in Berlin. And they said that they had therefore, quote unquote, requested help from the OPCW afterward. But it appears that sort of sequence of events is misleading, and that they had actually already called the OPCW in before they had even looked at Navalny at all. So I think that is sort of like that's basically what I had on this newest piece to the story. And sort of on its own, like, it doesn't prove a whole lot. Like, it does, I think, raise some pretty big questions about, why the Germans decided to do what they did when they did, and why did the OPCW's timeline for this suddenly change. The Russians, I know, have noticed this, and they are demanding that somebody explain it, like what's going on with this timeline that's changing and that's raising some very strange questions. But I don't think they've given any answers yet, the Germans or the OPCW. But I'll let you jump in real quick if you have anything else to say. But there's other stuff. There's a lot of other discrepancies that, in addition to this, like, make it look very fishy.
Yeah, well, I guess one thing I just want to remind people is that the U.S. Has sanctioned this Alexei Navalny, or sanctioned Russia on behalf of this Alexei Navalny figure, who was had his prisoner of conscience status revoked by Amnesty International because he has made unrepentant calls for violence. And a lot of this we are kind of, I think, taking somewhat on the word of Alexei Navalny, or at least he's alleging that this team has been following around for a long time and stuff. And we should realize that this is like a Richard Spencer or Chris Cantwell type figure. He's a white nationalist type, and so
Right.
not necessarily that means anybody shouldn't trust his word, but it's very interesting that there's so much sympathy paid to him by the U.S. mainstream media when he has some pretty repulsive political views, and I think is a little bit more of a fringe figure than they like to portray him as. So, well, let's get into some of those other inconsistencies.
Yeah, sure. And that is absolutely right. I think, like, his status as an opposition figure in Russia is often hyped up in Western press, and that if you actually talk to Russians, like, it's like some people haven't really heard of this guy. It's kind of a similar situation with Juan Guaido in Venezuela. Like, you talk to some Venezuelans, they're like, I don't really know who this guy is. But in the Western media, it's as if he's some, like, heroic freedom fighter that everybody, he's a national hero for his people or something. But yeah, anyway, just sort of to swing back to some of these more, like, there's been a lot of inconsistencies in this whole story. Like, the initial Russian poisoning claim came from Navalny's own staffers. They were the first to put this idea out there, and they had done so within, like, moments of the story breaking. But since it first came out, it's changed around quite a bit. So first they had said that he had tea at the airport, and that this had to have been what was poisoned because he hadn't eaten or drinking anything else that day. And so, like, it seemed like, oh, this is the obvious culprit of how he was poisoned. And I think we mentioned this when it first happened too, but, like, they just happened to capture a photo of him while he was sipping that very cup of tea, which made for this, like, ideal visual when the story was first breaking. I always found that to be a little, like, just a little too perfect. I don't know, but that's neither here nor there.
And
Maybe
for
it's just
I think for a little bit more context too, Russia is at least alleged to put some kind of, like, nuclear material in somebody's coffee at one point. I think to
right, like
to
polonium.
kill. Yeah, polonium. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that people are pretty convinced Russia was behind that. But that, yeah, it just kind of fits in with that narrative, I think.
Yeah, it just seemed like just a little too perfect, like everything fell into place like that. But, I'm not drawing any too, intense conclusions from that. I just thought it looked kind of odd. However, a few weeks later, after this story initially happens and Navalny gets sick, his people then changed the story, and they said, and this is probably the weirdest part of the whole thing, and they say a water bottle in his hotel room had been poisoned, and they claimed that a German lab had confirmed the presence of a nerve agent on the bottle. And they had originally made this claim in a very weird venue on Instagram, in an Instagram little post and video. That's where this originated. And that was picked up in every major Western media outlet everywhere. But then it's very strange because ever since then, it's basically never been mentioned again. The German government never confirmed anything about a water bottle, nor did the OPCW or anybody else. Like, as far as I can tell, this detail was solely sourced to Navalny's own aides and staffers. And then it just disappeared, despite it supposedly having been confirmed by a German government laboratory. And you'll notice, too, in all the Western media coverage of this, they just cite Navalny's aides and just take their word for it. Like, they hardly even attempt to verify it beyond that. But at the time, it did seem like, oh, wow, it's some damning new piece of evidence. And it just kind of, there's no follow-up. It just kind of goes away. And so I just find that very odd. Like, there was one other thing that was mentioned afterward, but it certainly doesn't make the story any more convincing. Because later on, one of his staffers, this guy named Georgy Albarov, had claimed that the bottle probably was not the source of the poison, and that Navalny must have somehow transferred this nerve agent from his mouth onto the bottle. And, like, I mean, I'm no weapons expert, but that seems utterly implausible to me, to say the least. That like he contaminated the bottle with his mouth. Like, how long ago would he have been poisoned? How long is he walking around with this like crazy lethal nerve agent, apparently Navichoke, in his mouth? Like, how long did it just the whole thing seems very strange.
Right.
So the whole like mystery water bottle situation doesn't add up at all. And to me, it kind of says that Navalny's people maybe aren't credible in their claims. Like they said, this was verified by a government lab, but like that appears that's not the case. And so like I don't like how much else are we going to take them seriously on if they're going to fabricate something as serious as that.
Right.
However, again in December of last year, the story changed again and became even more ridiculous. And you had mentioned that like big long Bellingcat investigation they did, where they claimed to have identified the FSB agents involved in the poisoning and all this. I honestly found a lot of that very questionable. The FSB stuff, it just seemed like a little Hollywood-like and cartoonish. And even in that investigation, they had Navalny go undercover and speak to these alleged agents on the phone personally, which that part also seemed a little weird. But in one of those calls, that's where the guy says that he put poison on Navalny's underwear, that he smeared it on there, and that's how it happened, apparently. And as far as I know, that's sort of like the latest version of the story. That's like the latest claim, the latest iteration of it, where it started at the T at the airport, and now it's they smeared it in his underpants. And actually, I don't even think that part made it into Bellingcat's article. I think it's only in the actual like audio because I went through and looked through the investigation. I couldn't find anything about the underwear. But other people did then pick that up. You know, our favorite Russia kook truther at The Guardian, Luke Harding, he covered that for that outlet. They all seemed to take it very seriously about the underpants. But you know, I just found that to be sort of like the culmination of the ridiculous, like changing story here. And then to top all of this off, too, there's also the fact that Navalny, this is not the first time he's claimed he's been poisoned and like tried to turn it into this big like PR stunt and controversy. You know, like I guess it's possible he was right about the last time he claimed it too. I think he was in jail at the time. But like, what like the Russians just somehow can't kill this guy, like despite using these lethal nerve agents like Novichok. They've had every opportunity to do this for years, and yet they're now 2 for 2 in failing to like they poisoned him but couldn't kill him. And then you also have, you know, Sergei Skripal, who is said to have been poisoned by this stuff. Just, I don't know. A lot of this stuff just kind of doesn't seem to add up to me. I don't know what happened to this dude. I don't know how he fell ill, or maybe someone else did poison him. I certainly don't support the Russians necessarily throwing him in jail for trying to like organize protests and stuff. Like, I'm not for that. But the whole poisoning narrative just has tons of red flags. And it really, I think, fits in with other questionable things we've seen recently, like the Skripal case, like the OPCW's work in Duma in Syria. Like there's just parallels here that I think are hard to ignore in this case.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'll add, Will, is it seems odd to me that Russia would have this alleged super deadly chemical weapon, Novichok, and they used it on Sergei Skripal, an older man in the UK, and it didn't kill him. And then they used it again against Navalny, and it still didn't kill him. And I mean, it just seems like kind of an odd thing to try twice. But